Tonight at 10, the man who was Boris Johnson's closest advisor says thousands have died needlessly during the pandemic. Dominic Cummings told MPs that the handling of the pandemic was flawed from the start and that chaos had reigned inside Number 10.
When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that. Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
There was a blistering attack on the performance of the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who was accused of lying repeatedly.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions.
And Mr Cummings went further, declaring that Boris Johnson's handling of the pandemic made him unfit to be Prime Minister. Also tonight, 32 years after the Hillsborough football disaster, 2 former policemen and a solicitor are cleared of altering police statements. A special report on forced adoptions. We hear from some of the children who grew up not knowing their mothers. The legacy papers and personal possessions of the late Professor Stephen Hawking are to be saved for the nation.
Up there, long-range effort breaks and Cavani's there! Manchester United are level!
And in tonight's football, it's extra time in the Europa League final between Manchester United and Villarreal.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel, he's back on the market. The former Chelsea manager Antonio Conte leaves Italian title winners Inter after 2 years in charge.
Good evening. For 7 hours today, the man who used to be Boris Johnson's closest advisor lashed out at the Prime Minister's handling of the pandemic. Giving evidence to a parliamentary committee, Dominic Cummings, who left Downing Street last November, said thousands of people died who didn't need to die because of a failure of leadership in government. In a relentless assault, Mr Cummings declared that Boris Johnson was unfit for the job and likened the situation in Downing Street to an out-of-control movie. There was a blistering attack on the performance of the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who was accused of lying repeatedly, but the Prime Minister had refused to sack him. And on the wider context of the handling of the pandemic, he said that there were major failures from the start and a realisation that there was no serious plan for lockdown or for protecting society's most vulnerable people. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, listened to the session, and the report does contain some strong language which was heard at times.
Reality or revenge? Delving back into troubled recent history. Dominic Cummings' day to give his version of events. A verdict of failure and an apology for his part.
Senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
The government's public position at the start was it was well prepared. But he revealed how in the second week of March, senior officials suddenly, in graphic terms, said that wasn't the case.
Helen McNamara said, I've come through here to the Prime Minister's office to tell you all, quote, I think we are absolutely fucked. I think this country's heading for a disaster. I think we're going to kill thousands of people.
He described the original expectation, a peak in early summer, protecting the most vulnerable. But as flaws in the numbers emerged, how rapidly plans were sketched out on whiteboards to accelerate to lockdown, showing if nothing changed, the NHS would collapse, and the poignant line, who do we not save? And why did it take him so long to ask the Prime Minister to change his mind?
Do you not recognise that that was a massive failure on your part?
Yes, it was a huge failing of mine, and I bitterly regret that I didn't kind of hit the emergency panic button earlier than I did. But I was incredibly frightened, I guess is the word, about the consequences of me kind of pulling a massive emergency string and saying, the official plan is wrong and it's going to kill everyone and you've got to change plan. Because what if I'm wrong?
Number 10 sounded sometimes in chaos. On one particular day, grappling with the possibility of lockdown, potential strikes in Iraq, and the Number 10 dog.
So we had this sort of completely insane situation in which part of the building was saying, are we going to bomb Iraq? Part of the building was arguing about whether or not we're going to do quarantine or not do quarantine. The Prime Minister has his girlfriend going crackers about something completely trivial.
And a Prime Minister unwilling to take the disease seriously.
In February, the Prime Minister regarded this as just a scare story. If we have the Prime Minister chairing COBRA meetings and he just tells everyone it's swine flu, don't worry about it, I'm going to get Chris Whitty to inject me live on TV with coronavirus so everyone realises it's nothing to be frightened of, that would not help actually serious planning.
Only halfway through,
I will first call the Prime Minister to answer
the Prime Minister had to defend the claims next door.
This morning, the Prime Minister's former closest advisor said, when the public needed us most, the government failed. Does the Prime Minister agree with that?
The handling of this pandemic has been one of the most difficult things this country has had to do for a very long time. And none of the decisions have been easy. To go into a lockdown is a traumatic thing for a country.
Mr Cummings' real vitriol was saved, though, for the Health Secretary, who may not just be able to run away from a long list of accusations.
I think that the Secretary of State for Health should have been fired for at least 15, 20 things, including lying to everybody in multiple occasions, in meeting after meeting in the Cabinet room and publicly.
Whether he claimed misleading on testing, on PPE, and putting people in care homes in danger.
The government rhetoric was we put a shield around care homes and blah, blah, blah. It was complete nonsense. Quite the opposite of putting a shield around them. We sent people with COVID back to the care homes.
The Health Secretary's teams rejected his claims.
I haven't seen this performance today in full, and instead I've been dealing with getting the vaccination rollout going, especially to over 30s, and saving lives. I'll be giving a statement in the House of Commons tomorrow, and I'll have more to say then.
Then there were accusations that the Prime Minister wouldn't listen to Mr Cummings or the top scientists to bring back lockdown to save lives in the autumn, as COVID began to take hold again and cases rose.
Now, I said to him, the whole lesson of what happened before is that by delaying, the lockdown came later, it had to be more severe, it had to last longer. Surely we've got to learn the lessons from the past. The Prime Minister decided no and said, basically, just going to hit and hope.
Whose advice was he taking?
He wasn't taking any advice, he was just making his own decision that he was going to ignore the advice.
Did you hear him say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands?
I heard that in the Prime Minister's study.
The PM's denied that, but was blasted by the man who helped him into Number 10.
Fundamentally, I regarded him as unfit for the job, and I was trying to create a structure around him to try and stop what I thought were extremely bad decisions.
The relationship between Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson is bitter and broken. So there's no surprise the former aide didn't hold back today. But whatever his motivations, Dominic Cummings was Boris Johnson's most senior advisor during the country's worst crisis in many decades. So his evidence can't just be brushed off as irrelevant. But after hours, for those who lost family, for those who've suffered, perhaps this most important verdict.
Tens of thousands of people died who didn't need to die.
For the first time, someone who was involved in making the decisions during this crisis has come to that conclusion in public, a claim the government's always disputed or tried to ignore, but one day will have to answer in full. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, in a year of disputes and controversies within government, one of the most talked about events during the first lockdown was Dominic Cummings' infamous trip to Barnard Castle in County Durham, the purpose of which, he claimed, was to test his eyesight. Well, today he admitted that he hadn't told the whole story. He apologised for his handling of the matter, but he said that there were security reasons for the trip, which he should have been more open about. Our Deputy Political Editor, Vicky Young, reports now.
We'd all been told to stay at home, but Dominic Cummings didn't.
He in fact travelled to his parents' home in Durham.
Before setting off, he was seen rushing out of Downing Street after discovering his wife had COVID. Weeks later, in the Rose Garden at Downing Street, he was forced to explain.
I was worried that if my wife and I were both seriously ill, possibly hospitalised, there was nobody in London that we could reasonably ask to look after our child and expose themselves to COVID.
But today he revealed another version of events.
My wife called saying there's a gang of people outside saying they're going to break into the house and kill everybody inside.
So it was actually repeated security threats which prompted the move to Durham. But when the story erupted, Mr. Cummings decided not to mention that.
Now, at this point, I made just a terrible mistake, which I'm extremely sorry about. So I ended up giving the whole Rose Garden thing, where what I said was true, but we left out a kind of crucial part of it all. And the whole thing was a complete disaster. And the truth is, and then it undermined public confidence in the whole thing.
The most bizarre part of Mr. Cummings' original story was the now infamous drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight after being ill with COVID.
I think if I was going to make up a story, I'd have come up with a hell of a lot better story than that one, right?
You were testing your eyesight with your wife and child in the car with you.
It didn't seem crazy at the time, and obviously I wish I'd never heard of Barnard Castle, and I wish I'd never gone, and I wish the whole nightmare had never happened.
After his evidence today, it's his colleagues still in government who'll be having nightmares. Vicky Young, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as we've heard, Boris Johnson repeated again today that in dealing with the pandemic, his government has at all times followed the scientific advice. Our health editor, Hugh Pim, looks at what we learned from Dominic Cummings today about the scientific and health assessments that were available to the Prime Minister throughout the crisis.
Some will contest it, but today's dramatic evidence shines new light on the government's handling of the biggest peacetime crisis in modern times. Dominic Cummings' account of the first COVID wave in 2020 is highly critical of ministers and officials. British people back from Wuhan in China were quarantined in late January. But until the end of February, he said, there was no attempt to get on a war footing. Some key players even took skiing holidays. All this as Italian hospitals were being overrun with seriously ill COVID patients. Mr. Cummings argues there should have been tough restrictions by early March. But big sporting events like the Cheltenham Racing Festival went ahead. He says experts thought stopping these events would mean people went to pubs instead. But he says this was the wrong approach, and officials were also misguided in thinking the British public wouldn't accept a lockdown.
Now is the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact with others.
By March the 16th, he says, there'd been a big change in thinking with the start of restrictions, though a full lockdown was delayed another week. But a medical expert on one of the main advisory groups says none of the options were clear-cut.
Really urgent action needed to be taken, but that was very difficult, I think, for the politicians to balance all the different inputs they were getting from the scientists on one hand and from those who really felt that this was going to be very damaging to the economy on the other.
Mr. Cummings slams the lack of preparation, including shortages of PPE. He alleges even with virus cases surging, there were no urgent plans to secure more supplies. By September, the second wave of the virus was developing. Mr. Cummings says action should have been taken then. The testing system was coming close to being overwhelmed, and he claims the Prime Minister rejected the idea of a short circuit breaker lockdown in England. Some experts agree that was a mistake.
There was a lot of arguments in favour of taking early action in the autumn, in September, when we could see that cases were rising again and we didn't have vaccines. People had been able to travel and we'd re-imported infection back into the country, people moving around. We should have done something earlier.
The number of UK deaths is one of the highest of leading industrialised nations. Mr. Cummings said mistakes had been made and he was sorry for his part in them. Adrian Hamer died with COVID on Boxing Day, aged 55. His widow Lisa says today's developments provide no comfort.
Mistakes have been made. People need to be accountable for their actions and they need to take accountability. They all need to take accountability and learn. Because if this ever happens again, God help us.
More chances to learn will come with a public inquiry next year. Others will give their version of events. Some may well differ from those of Mr. Cummings. Hugh Pim, BBC News.
Let's go live then to Westminster, and Vicky Young is there for us, our Deputy Political Editor. Vicky, given this tidal wave of criticism today, where does that leave the Prime Minister?
Well, Hugh, over the years, I've watched hundreds of select committee hearings like that, and I have to say I've never heard anything quite like it. Someone who so recently has been at the heart of government during such a traumatic period for the country, and who has, of course, turned on his former boss, the Prime Minister, in spectacular fashion. Now, for many, of course, he's an unreliable witness. Many only know him because he broke lockdown rules. He, of course, left Downing Street after a power struggle. And at times today, he did sound a bit like he had an axe to grind. And actually, he was the only one who really had all the answers. But of course, no government can just dismiss 7 hours of evidence like that, because what he laid out was really an appalling failure across government, whether it was planning, whether it was decision making, whether it was officials, scientists or politicians. They all came in for criticism. But of course, this is only one man's version of events, and we will hear others starting tomorrow with the Health Secretary Matt Hancock. He came in for searing criticism. He, though, will answer questions in the House of Commons tomorrow, and he will front a press conference. Now, the public inquiry into this COVID pandemic is due to start next year, but the arguments, well, they're already raging.
Vicky, many thanks once again. Vicky Young there for us at Westminster. And let's just take a look then at the latest official figures on the pandemic. 3,180 new infections, 9 deaths reported in the latest 24-hour period. And in the vaccine rollout, 186,147 people have received a first vaccine dose in the past 24 hours. In total, more than 38 million people have had their first jab. That's nearly 73% of the UK adult population. Nearly 388,000 people have had their second dose in the past 24 hours, meaning that more than 23.5 million people have had the 2 doses. And that is just about 45% of the UK adult population. The day's other main news now then, and the survivors and families of the victims of the 1989 Hillsborough football disaster have reacted with anger and bitter disappointment after 2 retired police officers and a former solicitor were acquitted after a judge ruled that they had no case to answer. They had been accused of trying to minimise the blame being placed on South Yorkshire Police in the aftermath of the disaster, in which 96 Liverpool fans died inside the stadium. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has this report.
Hillsborough is a double tragedy. The disaster itself, 96 lives lost when the football terraces became overcrowded at the Sheffield Wednesday ground. And its aftermath, as fans were unjustly blamed for their own deaths. The families of those who died have spent 32 years fighting for justice. Today came the end of the legal road as the last trial collapsed.
Does not mean that there wasn't a cover-up. It just means that the law as it is today is not fit for purpose. There needs to be something done to recognise that the 96 were failed, they continue to be failed, and not only that, is it setting a standard for everybody else who is getting shafted by the establishment.
Former police officers Alan Foster and Donald Denton and retired solicitor Peter Metcalfe were accused of amending statements to mask police failings after the disaster. But the judge ruled that Mr Metcalfe and his co-defendants have no case to answer.
This false accusation of cover-up has been whipped up continually over the years. The facts were investigated here yet again by a judge and jury. There was no cover-up at Hillsborough.
Though it's not disputed that the statements were changed, the courts found it didn't amount to a crime. The judge accepted that the defendants didn't know the statements were going to be used for anything other than the 1989 public inquiry, which was not a court of law. This is the former headquarters of South Yorkshire Police. Back in 1989, officers met here to organise the SYP response to the disaster. The police statements ended up being used for 3 purposes: the public inquiry, the first set of inquests, and the original criminal investigation into Hillsborough. Despite a string of inquiries, inquests and trials, the Hillsborough families and survivors don't feel they've had accountability. As Culture Secretary, Andy Burnham backed their campaign in 2009. Today, he called for a change in the law.
I proposed a Hillsborough bill when I was in Parliament to give families like Margaret and others parity of legal funding when they are at an inquest where the state is involved. That is the very minimum we should be demanding.
The recent Hillsborough investigations are said to have been the longest and most expensive ever mounted in Britain. The Crown Prosecution Service has defended its decision to bring this prosecution, saying it was important for a jury to test the evidence. But the bereaved say it's been a farce. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
Last night we reported on the suffering of hundreds of unmarried women in the UK who were forced to hand over their newborn babies for adoption back in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. They're now campaigning for a formal apology from the Prime Minister in line with practice in other countries such as Australia. And the trauma suffered by the mothers has been shared by many of the children. And some of them have been speaking to our correspondent, Duncan Kennedy.
Jan Shine is one of the children at the heart of this story.
I had an identity forced upon me. I feel like I just wasn't the person I was meant to be.
She was born in 1960. Her mother was 18 and unmarried and was forced to give Jan up for adoption. Jan says it's caused lifelong pain.
I'm angry for the system allowing me to be given to those people. I'm angry for the trauma and pain caused to my birth mother.
In the 50s, 60s and 70s, unmarried pregnant women faced intense pressure to give up their babies for adoption.
I was 17 years old, so this was 1963, but I found myself pregnant.
Pat Tugwell felt that pressure and remembers the cruelty she faced in hospital.
I remember one particular nurse who seemed to enjoy being quite rough when she examined me, and I remember her saying to me, "Oh, well, how did you get like this if you don't like somebody doing this to you?" You know, it was really quite abusive. They were quite abusive. That was horrid. That really sort of hurt me in a way. You know, I was a human being, you know. Why couldn't I be accepted for that? All I'd done was, you know, I was having a baby, made a mistake.
Around 250,000 unmarried mothers in Britain were forced into giving up their babies in the 30 years after the Second World War. The heartless attitudes towards them was reflected in documents from the time. In one, an official wrote, "The baby is beautiful, unlike its mother." The women were seen as a baby supply chain, unworthy of dignity or respect. Some birth mothers have cast doubt on the legality of the adoption consent forms they had to sign. That's reflected in this letter from an adoption hearing, which quotes the judge saying he was doubtful about the validity of the JP or magistrate's signature on the consent form.
I was lucky. I had really good parents.
Many children born to unmarried mothers did end up in loving families. Rachel Langham was taken to live in Canada as a baby, but still says her birth mother suffered.
I feel terrible empathy, you know, and sorrow for her, and it's terrible. But you certainly should apologise for any heinous things that you've done.
Tonight, following the BBC's reports on forced adoptions, MPs from all sides have joined calls for an official government apology to the birth mothers.
There is a huge amount of support for this motion, and we expect there will be a great deal of support within government for an apology to be issued. Every day these women have been told, you gave your baby up for adoption. They didn't, they were forced.
The children of the birth mothers agree that it is now time to act.
An apology is warranted, but of course it can't ever take away the pain and trauma that's been suffered.
The government says it sympathises with the birth mothers, but has stopped short of an apology. Those who've lived through forced adoptions say an injustice has been done. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News.
The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has defended the forced diversion of a Ryanair plane to Minsk, where a prominent critic on board was arrested. The EU and the UK have imposed new sanctions on Belarus following the detention of Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend on Sunday. Our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford has more details.
In Minsk, appearances are deceiving. This is a country in deep political turmoil. We were heading to meet a woman just plunged into the heart of it. She asked to meet in the open, on the edge of town, because Anna's daughter is now in a KGB prison, arrested with her opposition activist boyfriend when their flight over Europe was diverted by force to Belarus. The last Anna heard from Sofia was a text message. It just said "Mum." The next was a video confession taped by her interrogators. It seems clear it was done under duress. Anna is still reeling.
We are in such a state that we keep saying to each other, this can't be happening. We don't believe it's happening to us, to our daughter.
Anna says Sofia wasn't even part of the protests that swept Belarus last year. As Minsk turned red and white, with crowds calling for President Lukashenko to go. 9 months on, everything has changed here. The mass arrest of opposition supporters and people's own fear have cleared the streets of protesters. But Alexander Lukashenko is still very much in power. And today he made a defiant address to the nation from right here in the country's parliament. He called new sanctions over the diverted plane a Western plot to try to topple him.
Our ill-wishers have changed their methods of attack. They've crossed many red lines and the boundaries of common sense and human decency. They've moved from plotting riots here to strangling us.
It's no surprise many Belarusians are keeping their heads down these days. As a new summer begins, very different from the last. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Minsk.
Let's take a look then at some of the day's other news. In the Scottish Parliament, Nicola Sturgeon has set out her plans for the first 100 days of her new government following the recent election. First Minister said that the most important priority was to lead the country safely out of the pandemic, but she also raised the prospect of much closer cooperation with the Greens, who also back another independence referendum, including the possibility of Greens having positions in government. Police investigating the shooting in South London of a Black Lives Matter activist, Sasha Johnson, have arrested 5 men aged between 17 and 28. Ms Johnson was shot in the head during a party in the early hours of Sunday morning and remains in a critical condition in hospital. Now, the scientific papers and personal possessions of the late Professor Stephen Hawking are to be saved for the nation. The items include childhood letters, scripts from his television appearances, as well as his pioneering research. Most of the 10,000-page archive will be permanently housed at Cambridge University, as our science correspondent Palab Ghosh reports now.
There is nothing like the eureka moment of discovering something that no one knew before.
He was the world's most inspiring scientist. His research, photographs and letters are his legacy to the world, and they're to be saved for the nation.
Ah, here he is, yeah. Oh, brilliant.
His son Tim sees many of them for the first time, including a letter that his father wrote to his dad when he was just 6.
Dear father, once upon a time, some pirates were loading some treasure. I think it shows a sort of a tenderness in his relationship with his father. You know, he had a very sort of loving relationship with his dad, as I did when I was the age he was when he wrote the letter.
Here he is as a student. Motor neurone disease went on to debilitate his body, but not his mind. This is his most important scientific paper on black holes, which have such strong gravity that not even light can escape. In a covering letter to a leading journal, he writes immodestly, "The result reported is rather sensational. I feel it's necessary to publish something as soon as possible."
Your theory of a donut-shaped universe is intriguing, Homer. I may have to steal it.
His script from The Simpsons is an important part of the collection.
he had an enormous sense of humour. You know, that comes out through interviews that people will have seen, through that kind of characterisation, willing to be in The Simpsons, to let a little bit of fun be taken, if what that did was help to communicate about science.
The contents of Stephen Hawking's office will be transferred to the Science Museum in London. Most iconic of all is his wheelchair, a symbol of the physical challenges he faced and also the strength and determination he had to overcome them. The eventual aim is to reconstruct his entire office.
There are very few scientific spaces that survive, so actually having Stephen's office is wonderful because he is extraordinary, but it sends a big, powerful message about the prestige of science as well.
Future generations will now be able to learn about the life and work of a man who inspired us with his brilliance, courage and humanity. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
Football and Manchester United have been in action against Villarreal in the final of the Europa League tonight in Gdansk in Poland. 2,000 United fans travelled to the match, despite COVID protocols making travel to Poland far from straightforward. My colleague Ollie Foster has been watching the play.
Manchester United fans are used to European jaunts, but the journey to Gdansk has been like no other. COVID tests to get in, quarantine on return.
I was considering cancelling because I thought there might not be any of this and no fun or anything, and I'm so glad I didn't cancel.
Tests and everything have cost well over £300 and my ticket was 34 quid and the flight was 189. United subsidised the flight by 200 quid.
Everyone was tested on the flight, you know, everyone was going to be COVID-free, so we were actually pretty comfortable in the end.
Though it's not the top prize in Europe, United hadn't won a trophy for 4 years, so even without the challenges to get here, this felt big. Standing in their way, Villarreal, veterans of this competition, but appearing in their first major European final. Their manager Unai Emery's a master of the Europa League, and with the Spaniards' first opportunity, Gerard Moreno muscled his way onto the end of a free kick. So often the super sub in his playing days, could Ole Gunnar Solskjaer engineer a comeback from the sidelines? They made a bright start to the second half. Within 10 minutes they were level through Edinson Cavani. And this should have put them ahead. Marcus Rashford was left cursing himself. The dugout looked very lonely with the clock ticking down. The match was heading for extra time. And they are still in extra time, injury time. It's excruciating for those 2,000 Manchester United fans in there. It's still 1-1. It looks like it's heading for penalties. Do you know that on this very day, May the 26th, 1999, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer scored a very late winner to win Manchester United the Champions League. If they're to win the Europa League, well, they've left it very, very late again.
Indeed, Ollie, thanks very much for the update there. Gdansk, Ollie Foster for us, and that's it from us. Now BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.